So I think the success of SpaceX has had a very large impact in a permission to invest large amounts of money into the industry. Welcome to another episode of Just Another Space Podcast. I'm Tom Culligan, joined by Clayton Swope, and our special guest today, Mike French, a very good friend of both of ours and the show. Mike, thanks for being on with us. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here this morning. Long-time listener, first-time guest. This is very exciting.
I think you gave us hopefully our first 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Or maybe that was my mom.
Yes. There was no reaction from Mike there. We're not convinced he's listened yet, but
must have been on mute.
Yeah. Well, Mike was part of the inspiration for this podcast, so we're very grateful for brainstorming with you. And I like to think, even if you're not a regular co-host, you're like the neighbor that drops by, hopefully with some regularity as we get going here. And honestly, there's probably nobody better, I know from Clayton and my perspective, to talk about the big issues in DC and our space world than you, given your background at NASA as Chief of Staff, as Vice President of Space at the Aerospace Industries Association, and now at the Space Policy Group, which you founded last year and work with a range of clients in the space industries. But I think before we get into it, a lot of people might not realize that you started, or at least when I got to know your origin, you were an elections attorney, but I learned that maybe you even had a space career before that. Yeah, so true space nerd from the get-go. So, saw myself as a STEM career-oriented person. Miss Takadina, my Algebra 2 honors teacher, disagreed and put me on a path towards law, but actually applied to law school saying I wanted to be a space lawyer because I saw a coming intersection of technology, policy, business, coming together in the field. And so after law school, I was at a firm in LA doing defense and aerospace work. So that's where I started my career.
A high school educator for becoming a lawyer.
Exactly, right. The path was crushed.
Do you keep in touch?
I don't. I'm hoping that this podcast will reunite us.
But she's listening.
She's definitely listening.
What became of Mike French? She goes to bed every night wondering what became of Mike French.
Sometimes, what looks like a bump in your STEM path turns out to be just the opposite.
Okay, so what was the big issue at NASA when you were over there?
I'd say the issue that defined the era was President Obama's plan to cancel the Constellation mission, which was a large mission, returning astronauts to the moon, as well as a shift towards taking advantage of commercial systems. So at the time, the commercial cargo program was fairly nascent, and so the Obama plan was to buttress that cargo program, but also begin the commercial crew program. And so this led to quite a bit of consternation across the space policy community. Both with the cancellation of large programs was happening on top of two other things going on, right? A significant economic shock in the 2008-2009 period, as well as the end of the Space Shuttle program. And so you had sort of a widespread national economic crisis, and then two very, very large-scale space crises, if you would, all happening at the same time. And so quite a bit of difficult time, I'd say, sort of to move forward with an ambitious plan.
Do you see parallels now? Is there anything that looks similar, or does it look very different to what you see happening at NASA, maybe looking out into the next few years?
I think that there's similarities in the discussion of large program change. I think that's I think that you can draw some parallels there. I think there's some limitations in that, the overall economic situation is different. You have a very different dynamic here with Elon Musk playing a role, right? A space person sort of playing a role very close to the president. A dynamic that faced NASA in the 2011 time period is that at that time, I was actually not at NASA, I was at the White House. And so from the White House's perspective, the idea that early in Obama's term, there was a space issue was very surprising, right? At that time, the White House was trying to pass a healthcare bill, an energy bill, the Recovery Act had just passed, right? The idea that a Democratic appropriations chair and a Democratic Commerce Committee chair were threatening to withhold funds and subpoena the administration
It's just a very different thing, right? And very unexpected, type of environment. So, I think that we'd have to look at today, we'd have to think about any sort of large programmatic change as very much, I'd say, actually more central to sort of any sort of White House push versus in the Obama days, it being aligned with the White House, but not a top 10, right? It was part of sort of a broader change agenda, but certainly not what, anything the administration had come into office to do.
And what companies were really first and foremost in your mind then as innovators? You mentioned a pivot to using more commercial space options. Who was that then? Is that different than today, or it's the same companies we know?
Well, so really what it was about the original idea was very market focused, right? And so if you think about cargo, the idea of cargo was, can the United States government take advantage of industry capabilities, but at the same time, could the United States government, through some funding, some subsidy, help enable a commercial market, right? And so that's why cargo is sort of the great example of this as a method, right? And so at the time, right, there was first two companies involved there. I think one of the earliest was Kessler. A company called Kessler was, I think, one of the original.
Rocket plane Kessler, I think.
Yes. So they were, and then some of our friends in the community were part of that, part of that company. And that, I think that was under the Bush years, actually, where they got some funding. And it wasn't until sort of after that SpaceX and then Orbital Sciences came in for the cargo program, right? So the cargo program had a very different, the cargo program sort of, to me, is the purest of the idea of a commercial services contract that has that dual benefit of the government taking advantage of commercial capability, but also the government seeding a commercial market in the near term. That's not a criticism of the model in other cases, but the cargo one is the perfect one. And there was a commercial launch market that existed before. Existed then. It was going to exist the next year, right? And that's sort of, it's the purest form to me of the model.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thinking about our last episode where our guest was talking about businesses that think that there will be a market in the future, and then they try to build a product around this future market. This is something where there was a market. It was the government wanting to buy that, but undeniably at that time, and thinking even into the future, there was thought that it would grow with the retirement of the shuttle. But even then, when these programs started, there was a market there. It just was dominated by the government. Is that kind of how it was viewed?
No, not for cargo, right? Not cargo. I mean, we've had commercial launch in this country for a long time, right? And in the world, right? So at the time, you had a much more competitive launch coming out of, you had a lot of folks flying on Soyuz, right? So, if you look back, if you go back to, sort of into the 90s, you have, commercial launch taking place globally, right? You had a whole bunch of GeoBirds going into orbit, sort of in some commercial model. That's not necessarily a U.S. launch provider. Right. So
in the case of crew or cargo, there was already at that time when you first thought of that program idea, there was a market effectively to bring cargo to the station. It was just done a different way. So you weren't necessarily hoping that a market was going to be created. It was there. It just was dominated by the government as a customer. It was the government looking for that service, which is
there's more to it. There's a commercial market. There's a commercial launch market at the same time. So the program took advantage of the fact that government needed its services, right? That it was gained from the Space Shuttle that was retiring, but there was a commercial launch market that these providers could enter into, right? So that gave them the incentive to put skin in the game and fund development, because the NASA money helped build both the set government services, but also allowed them to enter the commercial launch market, which was an existing market, right? So that's why, to me, it's sort of the ultimate example of these programs.
So the real winner there, that was Falcon 9 then, or would you say Antares too? Just to me, that doesn't strike me as a strong commercial.
It never sold a commercial launch, on Antares.
SpaceX, certainly leveraged it to dominate the commercial market. Antares has not, you haven't seen the same path. And again, that might have been a business decision as much as, I don't know how much of a business aspect there was from the Antares team. If you also think about it, which is probably at that time is when Orbital got bought by Northrop, right? So you also had sort of a business change. I'm not sure.
Or ATK first, right? And then
ATK, yes. And so I don't know under the original plan, whether Orbital saw a future of commercial launch. I don't know, but
so I think they did. If I go back, I know we're getting way in the weeds, history of cargo, but Antares is kind of interesting because you remember the first engines on the Antares were the old NK-33s that were kind of expatriated out of the Russia right after the end of the Soviet Union, and there were a ton of them because obviously the what was the Russian lunar rocket never made it, and so they had this excess capacity.
That sound right?
Was it N1? Yeah. So you had all these NK-33s that then Aerojet got and refurbished as the AJ-2026s, I think they were, and I think it's funny because you had actually, was it the Ukrainian company? Is it Energomash? Not the Russian one. I forget doing like the core stage, and you had, it was sort of a fascinating like piece together of a rocket. And then of course you had the failure on Orb 3 with the NK-33s, and that was the end of that. So then they found a new Russian engine. So I think maybe there had been a lot of hope for Antares at the start, thinking they could leverage this kind of global supply chain and these opportunities they found, and then very quickly that fell apart. But
yeah, I mean, the story of Russian engines, right? Is sort of a bigger one that I think we talk about, right? So if you have its impact on ULA and the Atlas system, then but it's also its impact on the Antares side. Right. Yeah. And the change to a new model, looking for a new engine provider, right? If we look at on the Antares side, right, Antares Cygnuses have been delivered via Falcon 9 recently, right? So you've seen Atlas, Falcon 9, they've looked to other launch vehicles for the delivery of Cygnus payloads. So it's kind of interesting, right? One, it shows a bit about the idea of multiple providers, right? And sort of the flexibility of now we've got a cargo capsule. How do we take advantage of other launch vehicles if we need to? But also on the other side, right, the sort of the reach of the Russian engine discussion that also impacting the cargo program.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting looking at cargo. Weirdly enough, because we're a bunch of space nerds, I think about this a lot. If I determine, am I getting better value today with commercial cargo in retrospect? I certainly did in terms of stimulating at least a new entrant into the market. Like Mike, you alluded to this, but like the government investment in commercial cargo was a far better deal than the government investment in every successor commercial program that's come on, starting with Crew. And certainly, I think if you look at HLS and XEVAS and things like that, where I think the government really was the minority investor in the commercial cargo COTS development program. I think that shifted. I think under Crew, I remember seeing some stat, like the government was paying north of 90% for the development costs, or at least at the time. I think given what Boeing's been through in recent years, Boeing actually might have ended up investing a lot more private capital in that program. But it really was a good sort of demonstration that but the interesting thing is you sort of traded the space shuttle. If you think about it, was like flying cargo on a 747, and you traded it for like an Embraer regional jet, so you got the redundancy and maybe the ability to control your flight rate a little bit more independent of Crew, but you're actually paying a lot more per kilogram to orbit because you're sending it basically on a private jet rather than on a big queen of the skies, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't seen what the latest sort of pound per kilogram is, though, right? I mean, the shuttle's an incredible machine, but quite a bit of cost per flight, right? I mean, and that was very evident sort of through its retirement, right? There's a lot of budget concerns that drove that retirement. You just on a cost per flight basis. But I don't think we're overhyping the impact of cargo from the broader market perspective, right? Because I think if we look at the capability of Falcon 9 and sort of a steady launcher of that cadence it's been enabling for what it launches, right? Certainly enabling for the Starlink system. But I think it's had an outsized impact on, I think, the role and increase of investment in the sector, right? So I think the success of SpaceX has had a very large impact in a permission to invest large amounts of money into the industry. And I think that was very true, right? If you go back to like 2014 to like 2018, but what's been really interesting is to watch that come back again, right? The fact that we have in the last 6 months, you're seeing over $100 million Series Bs and Cs. That's pretty incredible for what is a capital intensive, historically sort of low margin business. So I think a lot of that, I actually think it's not hyperbole to sort of look at the success of cargo and really tie it to what I think has been the space industry for the last 10 years.
I think that's a totally fair point. And it's really interesting how much, Mike, if you go back to your time at NASA, I mean, you had the Bush administration got the cargo program going, and that really felt at the time, hey, it's a bet because you can afford to lose cargo, right? Particularly if you have a second provider or somebody falls off or you have an accident. But crew at the time was still going to remain on a government vehicle. I think your time at NASA really reflected, particularly after the tussle between the administration and Congress, which I want to get into in a minute, and how that plays out, because I think to Clayton's point earlier, might shed some light about where we're going in this administration. But it really revectored the baseline to look, everything we do from this point forward is going to be baseline bought as a commercial service, at least in space operations and exploration. And I think increasingly we're starting to see that in science and maybe as a space technology. So to me, it was really an inflection point of we are going whole hog. We didn't really have all that data at the time. By the time you all came in 2009, I think the first flights for cargo were 2010, 2011 timeframe, the demo flights. It was like, hey, we're going to bet the farm on this business model as the way NASA does business in the future. And I think that was a very bold thing. Obviously, you and I at the time had a lot of back and forth in our seats on the Hill and yours over at NASA about, maybe the merits or the wisdom in that. I think in many ways, a lot of your confidence in the market was borne out. And in some ways, some of my reservations have also manifested in other ways. But I think that was a very interesting. And you I just want to go back to, you walked into that, right? Because you were not at NASA the first year or so of the Obama administration when a lot of the disruptive events were starting to take place, right?
That's right. I was at the White House for a lot of it. So I was at the White House working with the Chief of Staff's office at the time, Rahm Emanuel's office, during a lot of that initial, tension. And so, like I said, from our perspective, we were hearing a lot of very, very angry people at NASA for, why does the president have a space problem? And if you remember, kind of the joke at that time is when sort of the escalation of how the Obama administration dealt with things, when things got the biggest problem, there was the most unsolvable problem, the nuclear option in response was an Obama speech. So space received the ultimate response, which was an Obama speech. And so that there was quite a bit of work with OMB, a gentleman who, was pretty behind the scenes, but did a lot, was a guy named Rob Neighbors. Rob Neighbors was longtime approach staffer, I think he was deputy OMB at the time, but he came in and played a very personal role because Mikulski, the head of approach, had essentially threatened, major shutdown on the approach side because of space issues. Really just, right, like to sort of think about this as going on in the Obama administration, you sort of see why it sort of drove some of the political folks in the West going nuts, right? It's just not in their calculus while they're trying to build these coalitions on these other sort of top three seminal political issues they're trying to work. And so, so that's sort of the genesis of getting into what became the 2010 Authorization Act, right? A consensus around how do we work our way through this change.
So did Rahm deploy you to NASA to kind of clean up the mess? Was that sort of were you his bag man? You were there to deliver?
No, I wish I could take some sort of claim like that. My own person, I took a different path. I was sent over to Interior during the oil spill. So Deepwater Horizon occurred. So I was sent over to help support the then Secretary Salazar team with oil spill work. Solve that real quick. Got to move on and do some other things. But I started doing Landsat work actually. That, kind of returning to space, did some Landsat work, not as impactful as the NASA FY11 budget, right?
So, all right, so you get fast forwarding to today and what's happening at NASA, what's happening in the Trump administration on space, what's happening on the Hill. Yeah, Mike, what do you think are the main potential points of friction? Where are there points of agreement? I think for a lot in the space community, it's hard not to think about SLS, not to think about Artemis, not to think about a pivot to Mars. I think really so far we haven't heard that much from members. It's been mostly a lot of guessing. When do you think we'll start to hear more from the Hill on some of these topics? And not to say it's been totally silent, but you haven't really heard any of the, I guess I'd say almost like very strong behaviors that you talked about from key senators and key members back at the time of the Constellation. So when would we start to see something like that?
Well, a couple things, right? Well, a couple things. So first off, the response that we were talking about before, right, was in response to a budget proposal. So it was, official administration position to make these, fairly dramatic changes. I will say, I think that we saw some really important things out of the Hill last week or in the last 2 weeks. I think the statements by both Senator Cruz as chair of the Commerce Committee, and then also from Chairman Babbitt as chair of the Science Committee were pretty unequivocal, I thought, right? I thought they were pretty direct on their support of the Artemis program, of components of the Artemis program. I think they were very strong in, indicators of where they're going to be on sort of major disruption. I think that was pretty telling. I think I think the next big step is to see legislation come out, right? So Senator Cruz has said that they're going to dust off the Authorization Act we saw late last year that didn't make it all the way through. And we've also heard from Chairman Babin the same. So I think that'll be pretty telling because essentially what you're seeing there, right, is affirmative steps by both chambers to get ahead of what would be, essentially an FY26 proposal that could potentially have large change.
Yeah. What about, so to me, I think there's a graphic out there. I've seen it. It has 3 versions of the Raptor engine from SpaceX. The first one is, let's just say it has 3,000 parts. And then the second one, it has 2,000 parts. And then the third iteration has 750 parts. So you're doing the same thing effectively with this engine the whole time, but you reduce the complexity, reducing costs, reducing time to manufacture. What if you saw something like that applied to Artemis? And what I mean by that is that you see similar goals. Let's say get NASA astronauts back to the moon before China. But how that happens changes. So let's say it's not the same architecture that we were expecting, or it's different systems that are being used, but that goal is the same. To me, I'm just thinking on how it seems, I look at that Raptor engine and how maybe someone like an Elon Musk, or even just someone who is a founder of a company. I think of last week's episode 2 weeks ago, where we had a founder talking about how looking at the risk curve, effectively how cheaply, efficiently, as quickly as possible, can I do something and still keep the risk under control so that I can do my mission. And do that in a way that I feel like I'll be able to do what I'm saying I'm going to do, but I'm not 100% sure, but trying to push that envelope as much as possible. What if you see that happen for Artemis? And Tom, I'd be curious your thoughts too. What could a proposal like that look like? And how would something like that be received on the Hill? If it ultimately keeps with this notion that we're still going to do the moon, it just might look differently under the hood.
So I guess, let's take a step back, right? I think that, to me, sort of, I'll go back to your question before, right? Sort of, where are we overall? I said this, but late last year, regardless of who was going to win the election, to me, there's major parts of the NASA program, both in the human exploration side and the science side, that are not in good shape, right? Both NASA has been operating under a world that had increasing budgets each year and fairly ambitious out years. They're planning some fairly ambitious out years of spending. Those ended, right? NASA had its first appropriations decrease in a decade in FY24, right? And I don't see that growing in the future. It also has some significant program problems, right? On the science side, MSR has essentially broken the science budget.
The Mars
right?
sample return, right?
So,
yeah.
So we don't use acronyms on the show, Mike. Sorry.
Yeah.
We
Mars sample return broken. It took 40 minutes. It's unbelievable.
And we used a lot of acronyms, and I was like holding my mouth. I was say it, don't say it.
Well, I think I heard an SLS earlier, Clayton. So
I heard
COTS. I think
it's just iconic. That's just iconic at this point.
Yeah. So Right. And then on the Artemis side, right, if you look at the wedges and all the programs that are supposed to be funded versus where the funding is, it's highly constrained. And then if you look at program, right, milestones, they haven't been hit, right? You haven't hit, your timing milestone. So you're facing this issue of having to do something regardless of who's coming to the door, right? The what you do is an incredibly difficult problem, right? Because to me, the biggest thing you need to decide is, are you optimizing around some activity as soon as possible or some sort of more grand activity in some later but fairly indeterminate date? And that's really hard to do among a set of actors that are often operating in 2 and 4 year cycles.
DLD.
So coming full circle, Mike, you were there when the Obama administration rolled out the OG Journey to Mars, which we all remember, the branding and the graphic. I think that might have even been your
my old friend. I was looking for my old buddy, the squid. I was looking for. So there's somewhere I've got like the original sketch that me and David Weaver did of the Journey to Mars. I was actually looking. I was going to post it actually because if you think about what Journey to Mars was, right? It was about step-by-step capabilities, right? It was the moon, cislunar was the proving ground, and it was going to be the area to be the focus of commercial and international, right? Supported by NASA, while NASA had the horizon goal of getting to Mars, right? We were also going to get that asteroid on the way and save Earth. That was in there too. Not many people liked our asteroid retrieval mission, but the plans are there. I think.
I thought we were trying to keep asteroids away, not bring them back to Earth, which I think you guys were trying to do. Right?
I think
unless they have planet metals on them. Tom.
Right, but I think you need to know your enemy.
That's right. Yeah. I told this story last week, but one of the leaders at NASA during your tenure came up to brief us on the asteroid redirect mission on the appropriations committee. And I said, hey, if we go grab it and then go put it in lunar orbit, is it ours? And they looked around, they were like, that's a very good question. We don't have an answer to. It's like, I don't know. But if we picked it up, does it belong to the United States at that point? So, being a lawyer, a space lawyer, did you all ever resolve that question?
That's a yes.
That's a clear yes.
Yes. I mean, who else? I mean, come and get it, right? I feel like, are you bringing an asteroid back like it's yours?
Fair enough. No, it is funny how we have gone full circle back to the Journey to Mars. And, we went Journey to Mars to Moon, SPD-1 and the Trump one. Then obviously President Trump said he wanted to go to Mars. So then it became Moon to Mars. And now we're back to Mars of some flavor. I've heard maybe the pivot is not Moon to Mars, but it's Moon and Mars. So it is funny how we keep circling back around the same things we have to do and largely in the same ways to get there. Obviously different flavors, but
it's I don't think we've actually, it's interesting, right? I think I don't think that much has changed in a lot of ways, right? Because in both the Journey to Mars concept, I think as part of Artemis and all the Moon to Mars work that NASA's been doing over the last 4 years, it's all driven essentially by the same idea that there's this set of very difficult to do capabilities that you need to get to Mars. And how do we work backwards to how do we then think about the extensibility of what we do on the moon that's forwarding that ultimate goal, right? And I think that at the end of the day, it comes down to resources, right? And I think it comes down to where we were a little bit ago, which is what do you want to get done sort of in that near term and medium term? Because you got to make some choice that's where the bulk of investment has to go.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of the same ideas on what NASA should be doing that maybe have mostly not changed. Maybe the priorities have shifted, or maybe they will shift. But if we're talking about the same planets, which I think there are still 9 planets in the solar system, but I guess there's only 8 now, and my children will grow up thinking there's only 8. But a lot of that is not changed. But if we look at the resource question and the prioritization question now, and we think about DOGE and what DOGE is trying to do, trying to reduce headcount, looking at ways to save resources, maybe to reprioritize or do things differently. I look back at that example of the Raptor engine development. If we're applying that now to what NASA's doing, what do you think, Mike, would be the result? Where do you think they're going to go?
Well, so I think activities that have been happening over the last month from a sort of the personnel side are actually going to make it harder to do the analysis that happens, right? We talked about I've talked about how I thought regardless of who wins the election, there needed to be a strong program examination of both the human spaceflight and science budgets, but human spaceflight in particular, right? That hasn't yet happened, right? So there's people thinking about it, and there's certainly a lot of thought going into it, and right in Congress, I think is doing its own thinking about this and has its own thoughts on it too. But that is going to be a pretty significant. Any changes there are going to be significant, right? This is a divorce with kids. This is not breaking up with a high school breakup, right? So there's massive, personnel side and private employment side of this. There's a lot of legal sides to this on things called termination liability and how you can unwind a contract and what costs are still on the government, right? So to think about all that takes, you want it to be purposeful and thoughtful if you're going to try to make large programmatic change because, it's impacting real people throughout this country, and that anyone cares about, but certainly the Congress members that represent those districts care quite a bit. So to me, I think there's going to be a period where I think we get through sort of the nearest term of either DOE's personnel firings or contract actions, and you're going to have to then layer, okay, what's the large programmatic change that the administration wants for the Artemis program, right? To me, it's now just, you're going to have to do that same analysis, but you're using essentially a baseline that's just been disrupted, right? So can there be benefits to that? Of course, right? Sure. Maybe there's some benefits. Maybe it turns out that what was done aligns very well with what a thorough analysis would lead one to do. Sure. I think that's probable or possible. I don't know that it's strategic, I guess. That's very difficult for, right, a large agency to deal with, right? So you're going to have sort of, when I think about this from the mission support side, from sort of the infrastructure side and the personnel management side, they're going to spend several months, I think, sort of settling into what just occurred and then have to sort of decide, okay, now how do we go from there? I'm particularly concerned to the extent that a lot of the folks impacted are your brand new folks who you just brought in, or people, a lot of other probational folks are folks who are just been promoted or moved to a new role, right? So you had a lot of, the people in this probationary group are basically the people that were most thought about, right? If you think about it, right? They're most thought about in that they were the people that were just hired. So people just spent a lot of time saying, these are the humans we want to bring into the agency because something about them sort of represents sort of where this agency is going. Or they're the people that someone said, hey, we like what they're doing. We want them to go do this other thing, right? So these are kind of the two people, sort of the whole group are kind of the group that's the most recently considered in a positive light. And so again, that, could it all work out? Of course, it could be, right? But I think it's just sort of it's an additional unknown if you're about to do sort of a very large unknown.
Bigger shock than Constellation, Mike, you think, or equivalent? What's NASA? What should it be ready for?
I think what should NASA be prepared for?
Yeah, bigger shock than Constellation, cancellation, or equivalent, or just very different.
I don't think as big of a shock. I mean, I think that people, it's hard to. How do we measure this, right? What's the metric of shock, right? But I think any large program scale,
if
right?
It has awe, it's more.
Yes, right. That's true. So, I think any large program, any announced large program cancellation is certainly going to have, quite a bit of shock to it, right? I think that we are in a lot different place today on where we end up or where we can end up, looking at different capabilities and sort of different evolutions of things than we were in the Constellation. Right? There was nothing else really, right? And that was a very different thing. Where I think we are is that I think we're in a place today of we have the potential for very large pronouncements and then sober execution. I think we're actually well aligned for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've been there on the management side of NASA. I think about today, really since the start of all these commercial programs, you have fewer and fewer flagship programs carrying the NASA workforce, infrastructure costs, roads and commodes, as they like to say. So if I think about it, it's basically the space station, it's SLS, Orion, and Exploration Ground Systems, underwriting those costs anywhere between, like 30 and 60% of a NASA center's work and the human spaceflight centers. That one of the things I wonder about is, like, we talk about, hey, if I cancel this program, that program, I can save all this money. And we just saw the tweet over the weekend about canceling ISS. Well, the ISS is $1 billion a year. Sure, that's not insignificant. It's 1/25th of NASA's budget, assuming we're still going to pay for cargo and crew to go to other places in LEO, which NASA said they will. But it carries Johnson Space Center in a big way, and obviously in a part of Marshall. And so if I'm quote unquote canceling that, really, are we talking about downsizing those centers? And, do we think that Congress is going to go along with that? At some point, does Congress clap back here and say, yeah, thanks for your input, but just like in Constellation, we'll give you a commercial crew, but we're keeping, the centers and the kind of government-led deep space exploration elements. I think that's part of the debate that hasn't happened, because we're in that, your point about the broad proclamation speculation phase. But when you get down to it, how much savings are actually there, and what are you giving up if you're assuming you're not going to be able to just close centers or brack them or do that? And I go back to, like, the Griffin era's 10 healthy centers. Are we beyond a 10 healthy centers, moment in time at NASA?
Yeah, I also think that, and this is, I think, kind of after you get through all that, I think it's the point where it settles out, and then it says, how much appetite is there just the United States government to support civil space activity, right? And so if a large driver of that, has always been, at the end of the day, in my view, the Congress is funding space things to help life on Earth and to help real humans on Earth now, right? With the long-term goal that supports, I think, United States leadership. And so if you have a space program that doesn't have sort of immediate impacts to some broad section of the United States population, it's a different thing you're funding, right? You're essentially funding soft power solely, right? So then you're deciding, how much is it worth to pay for this very important sort of soft power projection thing we're doing, versus saying, how much is it worth to pay for both this very important soft power thing and a whole bunch of economic impact in my area today, right? So it's a different question, right? It starts to look a bit more like soft power spending in other areas, which, as you know, is not doing great right now, right? So, I don't know that we've fully thought that side out, right? And I feel like among the space community, I think we think others support space a lot more than others really do.
Yep. We support, I think, holistically. I remember when we were going through Constellation, right? My boss at the time said, look, I don't know yet about the details when we were trying to figure out how we were going to respond to this Mike French guy on the other side of the Pennsylvania Avenue. But I want America to lead. I want it to be perceived as a leader, and I want to go back to the moon, and I want America to lead that effort. And then, of course, there's all the economic flow down in the centers and things like that. So I think that Americans support NASA more as a principle and idea than they think through, we in the space community do, about like contracting models and innovation, chains and value and things like that. And I think we get lost in these debates, and most Americans just want to see people in blue suits going and doing really cool things, because it signals to the world that we're a leader and that we're still, honestly, number one when it comes to doing those things. And that's important to ourselves and to our allies. To project, I think
competition, Tom, to your point, is important. National prestige and honor. I don't know if the average person on the street would use those terms, but that's why we watch the Olympics. That's why we like sports. So the competition, I think, in this case with China, is a really important element that I don't think we can forget. And that looks a little different than a lot of different parts of what the government does. In space, that's very clear. And I think it has been since the original space race. So it just is a slightly different flavor today that people are still going to pay attention to and be interested to see, like you said, Tom, the USA retain the number one space power.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder too, Is it the same feeling if it's rich people paying their way to go do these things? Like we see sometimes in some of these other adventurers, whether you're going to the bottom of the ocean or you're jumping out of high altitude balloons, it doesn't quite capture that, or even the private astronaut missions. We haven't seen the same. There's something about, and maybe it goes back to like that core identity as an Americans. You think about John Glenn and Shepard and those guys. They were kind of us. They were middle-class people selected because they were the best of us, and we went along on the journey with them. And I do think there's something there that it's an intangible, but it's something that is very American. Whether or not that matters anymore, I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. And I think a lot of it is just planting the American flag, literally or figuratively. I think that strikes a chord with people. It always has and probably always will. And I think that's just what we take a lot of pride in as a country.
Mike, we want to do a couple lightning round questions with you as we wrap up here. So we're going to put you on the spot. So favorite space memory in your career?
Yes, that's more than a lightning level. I think it's an early one in my NASA career is I probably, first week I go I go to use the restroom there in the A suite and I look in the restroom and who's standing there next to me is Bill Nye, the science guy. And I think, and I was like, this is hilarious. Like in the NASA bathroom is Bill Nye, the science guy. Like it's like, you can't make this up. I'm like, is he always here? Like, what? This is unbelievable.
Did he wash his hands?
A dumb one, but I thought that was just such a funny one. I just couldn't make up that I had Bill Nye just hanging out in the administrator's bathroom. My first week on the job.
He wasn't doing an experiment in there, was he? He was.
Oh yeah, I don't know. I don't think he was filming, so that's good.
Another one. What issue, as you look at the space industry and policy space this year, what do you like the big issue that you don't think people are paying attention to that they should be right now?
So I think that the issue we never pay enough attention to is spectrum. So to me, I think I've joked before that I have a tattoo that says spectrum issues are space policy issues because everything we do is dependent on spectrum. But spectrum is wildly valuable by incredibly large industries that dwarf us, right? And I think that as we look to the biggest part of the space industry has always been communications. And the expansion of what we'll see with LEO communications, to me, brings space in the actual competitive realm of communications writ large. And that, again, what's the lifeblood? What allows that to happen? Spectrum. And so anyone that meets you and they want to get a space policy, I said, go learn spectrum.
Here. As we look at the year ahead, what capability or mission or company that's coming online are you seeing that you're like, this is really cool, this could be a game changer? Is there anything you're tracking, whether it's a new launcher, a new mission, a new technology?
Nothing, no particularly new technology. I do think that seeing, right, Kuiper launching is pretty important, right? If they need to get up by 26, I think that's going to be pretty important to the economy, right? If we see, looking at OneWeb and sort of how it's doing, I think that's all very interesting to me. Like I said, I think that LEO part of the comms business is really where the space business is headed. And so that's of high interest to me. I also think we're seeing, how do the Europeans deal with this, right? I think that's kind of one of the things I think is probably less on the radar of our US friends, but the European space industry is a really interesting place. Their three largest companies are talking about some sort of merger. They're talking about building their own LEO SATCOM system. They've obviously put a lot into Ariane 6 and having a launcher. So I think that we'll probably all be, while we're going to be all focused on the US and how much is happening here, I think that there's quite a bit of action happening in some of our key allies and partners, both from a government side, but also commercially.
That's a great point. Well, Mike, we want to thank you for spending the time with us today. You're a good friend. You always bring a fresh take on things. And honestly, I think I speak for both of us, one of the smartest guys in the space industry we work with. So we appreciate you doing this. And we like to wrap it up, as always, with a little bit of space history. So, Clayton, I'll throw it over to you.
Good. I thought you were going to say a song.
we can definitely do that.
Do you want to kick us off, Mike?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So our space news, we won't do it. We won't do it as a song, but maybe we could try that one time, Tom. I'm open to it. I'm open to it.
The musical, yeah.
Yeah, the musical. Just another space podcast, the musical. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. It was it a slow last few days in the annals of space history? Maybe. I saw, today in 2000, this is the final flight of the Space Shuttle Discovery.
Mike was there, right?
I think that one. I think I was the one guy at headquarters. That was often my job. I was often the one guy at headquarters. Everyone else got to do cool stuff.
Somebody had to keep the place running.
Everyone had to answer those mean letters from the Hill.
The real stuff. Yeah. Mariner 6 launched to Mars in 1969 on February 25th. And then I thought this was interesting. February 25th, 1960, the Soviets picked their first group of astronauts.
That's really early, right? That was pre-Mercury selection.
I don't know, actually. So yeah, we can reveal that we could Google that and reveal it on our next show. But yeah,
our audience will tell us, right?
Yeah, they'll be waiting to hear. Or they're checking right now.
Yeah. Well, I think those are great ones. And honestly, the final flight of Discovery, it's hard to believe that was already 14 years ago.
Right.
You think about, Clayton, you think about your kids and maybe even Mike, your kids. Like, I don't know, Mike, if you ever took yours down to shuttle launch or if they were old enough to do that, but it's hard to believe that, middle schoolers now lived in a world where the shuttle wasn't flying, which I know for me, maybe for all of us, it was the iconic symbol of space, growing up and certainly in the first part of our careers.
It seemed that long ago. Yeah. And I think, so that was what you said. Yeah. 14 years ago, Tom, you're right. So when I was born in 1981, we were just landing on the moon for the first time 12 years prior.
Wow.
So to think that it was longer than that, and to me, the Eagle has landed, that always just seems like very distant history to me. But really, it was shorter time frame than, to your point, the last flight here of Discovery. I'm
getting nostalgic here, tearing up a little bit.
Well, I mean, my kids all
Kleenexes
now just call me last century, so. I've now fully internalized, my age.
Well, guys, a great episode as always. Thanks again for doing this, and we'll be back next week
with
just another space podcast.
Bye.